그럼 지금부터 오늘의 첫 번째 세션을 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 오늘의 본회의 사회는 한국국방연구원 조남훈 박사님께서 맡아주시겠습니다. 박사님께 사회를 넘기도록 하겠습니다. 부탁드리겠습니다.
Hello, my name is Namun Cho, working for KIDA. It's my honor to moderate this great plenary session, and I'm really happy to see all the friends and colleagues and the ambassadors and all over the world. The topic that we're going to talk about today's session is regional order in the era of Indo-Pacific. The participants, we have 7 participants. Let me introduce them. However, I'm not going to do that in details. You can refer to this seminar booklet. And the first one to my left, Professor Jeon Jae-sung from Republic of Korea, and Dr. 필립선더스 from United States, and Professor Da Wei from China, and Sir Ida Masafumi from Japan, and Ambassador Catherine Raper from Australia, and Ambassador Susan R.치노이 from India, and Professor Louis Simon from Europe. Okay, we have 7 participants here, and I'm going to let them have the 7 minutes for presentations. And after presentation, I'm going to ask the additional question to each presenter. 3 minutes will be given. Today's topic, the regional order in the era of Indo-Pacific, is currently very popular and important topics, especially in Korea and the Asia and the Indo-Pacific. So I guess the discussion today will give us a great the forecasting or the policy proposal for the Indo-Pacific strategy. Okay, let's listen to the Professor Jeon Jae-sung. I'm going to give you 7 minutes.
Thank you very much. It's my honor and great pleasure to be part of this excellent panel. There was questions that was given a month ago. So this is my private, very personal and academic view. I'm not part of the government, so let me go through the basic draft very quickly. It's about South Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy. What are the meanings and characteristics, and what are the challenges ahead? So in December last year, as you know, the South Korean government published its Indo-Pacific strategy. While past South Korean governments have presented regional strategies for Southeast and Northeast Asia, this is the first time South Korea has systematically presented a regional strategy for a broader region encompassing India and the Indian Ocean, and is significant in this regard. As a middle power, it's difficult to say that South Korea has ever thought of a long-term, broad-based grand strategy. It has been presenting regional strategies that mainly deal with short-term and direct interests, and it has been difficult to think of a comprehensive regional diplomatic grand strategy, especially in the face of the critical security threat from North Korea. When thinking about South Korea's long-term national interests in terms of a regional strategy, it's also important to note that it contains South Korea's strategy for the international order. The current international order is undergoing a complex macro transition. It's experiencing multiple crises like we have never seen before, and various powers are competing and contesting over the future international order. So order is a big concept. Through its Indo-Pacific strategy, South Korea has clearly demonstrated its commitment to the liberal, rules-based order created after the Second World War. South Korea lays out the values of freedom, prosperity, and peace, but at its core is an emphasis on respect for national sovereignty, adherence to international law, the importance of human rights, and the importance of an open, multilateral, liberal international economic order. South Korea's inclusion of a comprehensive discussion of the international order in its strategy and making a central concept is an indication that South Korea has now reached the status of an emerging developed country. The liberal international order is currently facing many crises between the 2008 economic recession, the COVID pandemic, and order competition with China and Russia. It has been unable, the liberal order has been unable to adequately deal with many crises, and it has been in danger of degeneration. The Indo-Pacific strategy contains a consideration of how South Korea can contribute to the formation of a more evolved liberal international order that can overcome future crises. The second feature of the Indo-Pacific strategy related to South Korea's China strategy. South Korea's China strategy intertwined with the bilateral relations between South Korea and China, as well as the more comprehensive relationship between two countries in the Indo-Pacific region, so regionally, and how to reconcile the U.S.-China relationship with the context of the U.S.-ROK alliance. While the international order that China seeks is said to be a multilateral, rules-based order, for me, it is difficult to say with any certainty whether China will strengthen and advance the existing liberal international order, because China has its own ideas about the alternative international order in the future. The United States defines China as a systematic challenge to the existing order, and South Korea shared some of the same ideas that China could become a systemic rival to the existing order. Nevertheless, United States has proposed a so-called de-risking paradigm that emphasizes the importance of continued economic interdependence with China. In the period of the de-risking paradigm with China, the balance between government and the private sector in the United States and between U.S. interests and those of its allies becomes increasingly important, and South Korea should pursue a China strategy that comprehensively considers trilateral relations with U.S. and China. In its Indo-Pacific strategy, China has been very cautious in setting its relationship with China by proposing an inclusive international order. The question of what kind of China strategy to pursue in the context of the changing U.S.-China relationships remains crucial. South Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy can be divided into sectors, issue areas. Militarily, it is about maintaining the existing order and preventing changes to the status quo through coercion and strengthening its international deterrence strategy. As indicated at the Camp David Trilateral Summit, South Korea, along with the United States and Japan, pledged to strengthen military deterrence to maintain the status quo throughout the Indo-Pacific, especially in key flashpoint zones. Equally important to military cooperation is technological cooperation. It's no exaggeration to say that the future military balance of power in the Indo-Pacific will depend on the development of new technologies in the period of Fourth Industrial Revolution. So the United States has placed great emphasis on protecting military technology through export controls, investment restrictions in key areas such as supercomputers, artificial intelligence, and quantum computing. The U.S. is also committed to technological cooperation, international standard setting with allies. Cooperation among allies in military technology will be crucial in the future. So cooperation also in the global south is becoming more and more important part of not just U.S. but South Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy. So we have been engaged in development cooperation in the past with Southeast Asian countries, but we have to take this as part of the comprehensive effort to build a liberal order in the Pacific. Fourth, our strategy is closely tied with North Korea because many things are happening. So I'll skip this part as you all know that. So challenges. First, although the framework of the Indo-Pacific strategy has been presented, implementation, action plans in a very concrete context is very crucial. It is a great achievement that ROK-US-Japan Summit laid the groundwork for cooperation in each sector. However, South Korea's contribution will fall far short if it fails to come up with a concrete and systemic action plan across multiple sectors. As important as strategic cooperation is strategic autonomy to pursue South Korea's own national interests. And also cooperation with, Ambassador Aiboshi mentioned, cooperation with China and Japan will be important. In a summary. Second, it is crucial to build public support in South Korea, forging diplomatic strategic culture for the Indo-Pacific strategy, because the regional strategies are long-term, they may not directly translate into short-term, tangible national interests. For example, many agreements were reached at the Camp David summit, but it's not clear how they will directly benefit the people. So it can lose momentum if it does not strike the right balance between South Korea's value and concrete interests. Lastly, North Korean challenge can reduce South Korea's resources and focus on its regional strategy. North Korea does not have its own Indo-Pacific strategy, but is pursuing its own regional strategy through strengthening the ties with China and Russia. So North Korea is not just pursuing nuclear development and bilateral relations with South Korea, it is also pursuing its own development strategy for the long-term future. So we need to think more comprehensively about how to deal with North Korea in the Indo-Pacific power structure while fending off military challenges for Pyongyang. So in this regard, it's very important to establish a close relationship between our case proposed Indo-Pacific strategy and its so-called audacious initiative toward North Korea. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor John. I know that he's very punctual man and he kept his time on schedule. Okay, let me pass the next speech to Dr. Philip-Sanderson.
Thank you to the organizers for the invitation. I have to give the caveat that these are personal views, not those of the U.S. government. And given the time limits, my written remark has a lot more detail about U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy than I could fit in this presentation. That said, the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy issued in February 2020 is based on the recognition of the region's dynamism and its economic and strategic importance to the United States, to the region, and to the rest of the world. This has been a known fact in the post-Cold War period, reflected in the Obama administration rebalance to Asia, the Trump administration's free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. And I think the strategy lays out a U.S. vision for the Indo-Pacific with 5 parts: that it is free and open, connected, prosperous, secure, and resilient. And the strategy goes on to how the U.S. is pursuing each of these goals through multiple lines of effort. Let me say a little bit about each of them. In terms of free and open, the strategy argues that U.S. interests and those of our closest partners require a free and open Indo-Pacific, and that means governments that are able to make their own choices in shared domains that are governed lawfully. In terms of connected, the strategy seeks to build collective capacity in the region by adapting existing regional alliances, organizations, and rules, specifically by deepening U.S. alliances, strengthening U.S. relations with leading partners, contributing to an empowered ASEAN, strengthening the Quad, and supporting India's rising regional leadership role. In terms of prosperous, the strategy argues that prosperity of everyday Americans is linked to what happens in the Indo-Pacific, and that domestic U.S. investment and international cooperation is needed to support U.S. and regional development, and specifically proposes a new Indo-Pacific economic framework to pursue those goals. In terms of secure, the strategy argues that the U.S. defense presence in the region has supported regional peace, security, stability, and prosperity for 75 years, calls for extending and modernizing the U.S. role and enhancing U.S. capabilities to defend U.S. interests and deter aggression, and specifically advocates advancing integrated deterrence and deepening cooperation and expanding interoperability with allies and partners. And finally, in terms of resilience, the strategy argues that the Indo-Pacific faces major transnational challenges, including climate change, infectious disease, and natural disasters, and it needs to build regional capacity to respond. So with that as an overview of the strategy, what's an assessment of the progress and developments? I would say the Biden administration has pursued most of the lines of efforts articulated, with most success on diplomatic and security dimensions. The U.S. has worked hard to reinvigorate its treaty alliances, especially the U.S.-Japan-ROC trilateral cooperation. The Quad has met regularly, become somewhat more institutionalized, and gradually begun to take on more substantive diplomatic and security cooperation roles. AUKUS is established and is supporting deeper cooperation between Australia, the UK, and the United States. And these efforts have been augmented by increased U.S. military presence and security cooperation, including in Southeast Asia and South Pacific. The economic side, I would say, has moved more slowly. One thing that's underappreciated is the U.S. is trying to use domestic investment to try to recreate a political constituency in the United States for a liberal, global, and regional free trade and investment regime. And it's trying to articulate a framework that's good for middle-class Americans, but also good for the region. At the same time, the COVID pandemic has highlighted the importance of supply chains that are resilient in the face of disasters, epidemics, and state-led industrial policy. What are key challenges and opportunities? Well, I think there's several key challenges. I think first, competition with China has the potential to lead to military conflict, and it involves what's increasingly a zero-sum competition for regional influence in the military, economic, and diplomatic domains. It's worth noting that the U.S. regional strategy talks mainly in terms of positive U.S. goals for the region, hardly mentions China at all. That's a big contrast with the national security strategy and defense strategy that emphasizes threats posed by China and Russia. So getting these things right and the balance between them, I think, is a critical challenge, especially for a region that has concerns about how China is using its economic and military power, but also doesn't want to choose between the two countries. Second, as I mentioned, building a domestic political coalition that supports U.S. economic and security engagement in the Indo-Pacific is a critical political challenge. Third is this regional strategy has an ideological dimension in its emphasis on democracy and liberal values. That plays very well with closest U.S. allies in the region that are democracies, but key states in Southeast Asia and elsewhere in the Indo-Pacific are not democracies. And so there's a tension there between this focus on democracy and liberal values and the region's preference for inclusive institutions that don't include political criteria for membership. Opportunities, I think, are demand in the Indo-Pacific for an expanded U.S. presence and regional role, and a common interest in regional cooperation in order to deal with transnational threats and challenges. What distinguishes U.S. strategy? I think it is a long-standing positive U.S. regional involvement, formal treaty allowances, and formal presence, coupled with less formal security partnerships, and a positive history of cooperation with most countries, and the fact that the U.S. doesn't have territorial disputes in the region. These things position the U.S. to act on this strategy. We're asked to speak to recommendations. I'll concisely talk about three. I think there should be a general principle, personally, to support proposals for regional cooperation that both produce real benefits for the countries involved and also produce benefits for the region as a whole. A more positive view of U.S.-China competition is it could spur competition over cooperation, with both countries having proposals for cooperation in the region that try to meet real needs and win support. It might also create opportunities for other states in Asia to advance their own proposals. Second, I think to make full use of regional institutions to promote cooperation and manage tension. And third, to stabilize U.S.-China relations. There's a major adjustment underway as strategic competition has expanded and intensified, and to some degree, I think, become institutionalized. But I think it's important to build a modus vivendi between the U.S. and China that supports bilateral and regional cooperation and provides better tools to manage U.S.-China competition. That should include regular high-level dialogues on strategic and security issues and efforts to strengthen crisis management and confidence-building measures. I will say that the Biden administration has acknowledged the importance of cooperation with China and made efforts to stabilize relations, including recently visits to China by Secretary of State Blinken in June and Secretary of Commerce Raimondo in August of 2023. And I think this shows the importance that it places on stabilizing the relationship. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. He talked about the many aspects of U.S. The Indo-Pacific strategies. Okay, next I will ask to the Chinese the participants that way, and maybe China is the only country here who is not joining the Indo-Pacific strategy. So he has a lot of things to talk about. Okay, your turn.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for thank KIDA for inviting me for this important forum, and also this is my personal first visit to Korea after the pandemic. So very glad to be back. So I'm sorry I did not submit a written paper for this. For one reason is I was traveling, but the other thing is, as our moderator said, actually China does not have an Indo-Pacific strategy, and the topic of this session is the era of Indo-Pacific, but in China we don't use that term. We don't say Indo-Pacific. We don't admit it's a Indo-Pacific era. And also China, actually, we don't know if China is part of Indo-Pacific, to be honest. Of course, geographically, China is part of that. But when we talk about strategy, for example, my friend Philip, you mentioned the US Indo-Pacific strategy issued last year. I counted that PRC was mentioned 13 times, while 12 of them were mentioned in the first part. That's about the Indo-Pacific promise. It's a background, China as a challenge, China as a background of this strategy. While in the main body of that strategy, that is the second part, our Indo-Pacific strategy. In that part, China PRC was only mentioned once. That is in the part of the climate change. So from our perspective, China is a target of at least the US Indo-Pacific strategy, or a background, or a challenge need to be met, rather than part of the strategy. We don't know what the US is going to do with China in its Indo-Pacific strategy, no matter it's confrontation, competition, or cooperation, we don't know. So China is just barely be mentioned for that. So this is the first thing I want to say. We are reluctant to use that term. Second thing I want to say is, of course, no matter what term we use, we live in this region. In the past, we call it Asia Pacific. Of course, then plus India and the Indian Ocean. This is a region geographically, of course, naturally it exists. So for this region, what is China's strategy? I think this is a question we can answer. I think China has no new strategy in this region. For a very long time, China view Asia Pacific, of course, plus India, plus Indian Ocean area as an area that China relies on. This is China's neighborhood. This is an area that China think economic development opportunity. And this is also an area that China believe that very important for its security, for its safety. So there's no change. And China wants to achieve its economic development in that region. Maybe one new thing in past 10 years is obviously is the Belt and Road Initiative. This year, China will have the third summit of that, the 10-year anniversary of Belt and Road Initiative. I think the key term here is connectivity. China believes that if we enhance this connectivity in the region, China and other regions can benefit from that. Having said that, China has faced several challenges in this region. One is the emerging bilateral problems with the regional countries, including Japan, including some Southeast Asian countries, and also border conflicts with India, this kind of thing. And the other, more importantly, is how to deal with, how to respond the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy and how to manage China-U.S. relations. I will say China's strategy in this region, I mean Asia-Pacific plus India, let me use Indo-Pacific, in this region has been trapped by those bilateral disputes and also the confrontation, competition competitive relations with the U.S. So in China, there's also a lot of discussion about whether China should have a new strategy and to respond this new reality. But so far, we don't have any official documents yet. The third thing I would like to say is the challenges that we facing this, changing situation in the region and the China strategy lagging behind. I think we worry about two things. One thing is the major theme of this region, Indo-Pacific region, has been changed. In the past 3 or 4 decades, when we use the term Asia-Pacific, when we talk about Asia-Pacific, it means first peace, secondly development, economic development. When we say Asia-Pacific, or like when we meet in APEC meeting, summit meeting. But now when we say Indo-Pacific, I think also two things. One, security. Second, competition. I think the major regional theme in this region has been changed from peace and development into security and the competition. That's, of course, not in our interest. We feel very sorry about that. But I have to say, we already watched this tension in our region, but this region is still, a region facing a need of development, particularly for China, for ASEAN countries, for India, and for a lot of countries in this region. Economic development is still the major task. And this region, though a lot of tensions, we have not seen any major military conflicts in this region. It's different from Europe, right? So I think this is one thing, one concern. The other is this region has a possibility to evolving into different blocks. From China's perspective, we respect the US, Japan, the Korea, your decision to strengthen your trilateral relationship. That's your business. We respect that. And actually, I understand the concern from all the three countries. But the problem is we may, when on the one hand, when we see those three countries enhance their trilateral relations, at the same time, we are, like North Korean leader is now in Russia. So in China, we always say North Triangle, South Triangle. We already see the South Triangle. Now, will there be a North Triangle, China, North Korea, Russia? I don't think China will do that. I don't think that's in China's interest. But we do see a lot of interactions between, North Korea and Russia, and of course, China and Russia. So I think we have this kind of tendency. This region is evolving into two blocks. That's in nobody's interest. So we have to block that division, break that division of two blocks and increase our interactions among different countries. Okay, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dawei. He actually expressed China target of Indo-Pacific strategy. So China definitely has a different view against the Indo-Pacific strategy with other countries. But China Indo-Pacific strategy talks about the inclusiveness on the top of the strategy. And Indo-Pacific strategy includes not only the security aspects, but also other aspects like economic and environment or something like that one. So I guess we will have the chance to have a cooperation among countries, especially including the China. We'll talk about this aspect in the later. Okay, next one is Sir Ida Masafumi. Floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And I would like to express my sincere thanks to the KIDA for inviting me this very important Hongneung Defense Forum. In this opportunity, I would like to share my personal view on the Japan's FOIP vision with the participants and also the audience. So the FOIP, I mean the Free and Open Indo-Pacific concept, is originated from the Japan's former and the unfortunately late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's speech at the Tokyo International Conference for Africa Development in August 2016. In his keynote speech at this conference, he proposed the very important concept. The first one is the confluence of the two continents and also the two oceans. That means the confluence of the Asian continent and also the African continent, and also the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. So Indo-Pacific, the concept of the Indo-Pacific is, in my understanding, was firstly proposed by the Prime Minister Abe. And the Prime Minister Abe insisted the importance of ensuring the rules-based international order as international public goods. So he means mentioning by free and open as a important to ensure the rules-based international order or existing international order based on the universal values. And also, he raised the four major principles in his version of the FOIP vision. The first principle is the rule of law, rather than force or coercion, especially at seas. And the second principle is the freedom of navigation and overflights. And the third principle is the peaceful settlement of disputes. And fourth, the promotion of free trade. So these four principles are still principles for the Japan's FOIP vision at this time. And I think that one of the very important nature of Japan's FOIP vision is it is open to any countries, as long as any countries, any partners which shares the vision of FOIP. So that means the Japan's FOIP vision is open to even China, as long as China shares the concept of FOIP vision. And so it's not exclusive one. The Japan's FOIP vision is very inclusive. After the 7 or 8 years, by the speech by the Prime Minister Abe, this March this year, the Prime Minister Kishida announced the new plan for FOIP. Yeah, I'd like to explain the contents of the new plan for FOIP. In my understand, even though the Prime Minister Kishida announced the new plan, but the major principle and the major nature of the Japan's FOIP vision still remains the same. But the Prime Minister Kishida tries to expand the ways and means to promote and realize the FOIP vision by this new plan. So he said that the FOIP should be a guiding perspective to be shared by international community at the history's turning point. So still Japan expect the FOIP should be shared by many countries. And the core principle of the FOIP should be defending freedom and the rule of law and respect for diversity, inclusiveness, and openness. So the basic concept of the FOIP, still same with the original one. And the Prime Minister Kishida raised the new pillars of cooperation for FOIP. There are four major pillars to achieving the FOIP vision. The first one is the principles for peace and rules for prosperity. So the Japan's FOIP vision put emphasis on not only the peace, but also the development. So I think our vision shares the same, the FOIP vision, our FOIP shares the same vision with the China, that putting emphasis on the stability, peace, and also the economic prosperity. And the second pillar is the addressing the challenges in an Indo-Pacific way. By saying the Indo-Pacific way, this new plan means or put emphasis on the importance on the cooperation on the global issues like the climate and the environment issues, or global health, such as the pandemic, to deal with the pandemic, the next pandemic, and also the cooperation in the cyberspace. Well, and as a third pillar for achieving the FOIP vision is the multi-layered connectivities. That means, of course, enhancing the connectivities not only with the East Asian countries, but also the Southeast Asia, South Asia, and also the Pacific Island regions. So Japan will make efforts to connect our not only the economy but also the culture or the diplomatic relations with these countries more deeply. And also the knowledge and the human connectivity is important, and also the digital, promoting the digital connectivities, like the promoting the Open RAN, promoted by the Japanese government and the countries, and also the securing and the promoting the undersea cables are one of the part of our efforts. So the fourth one is extending the efforts for security and safe use and the sea to the air. So enhancing the rule of law at sea is one of the key issues in these pillars. So finally, I'd like to say a little bit about the achievement and challenges for the Japan's FOIP vision. So it is very clear that Japan's FOIP vision is shared by the many countries, like including the U.S., South Korea, Australia, and other countries. It is one of the clear achievements for the Japan's FOIP vision. And also, for example, the CPTPP is joined by the United Kingdom, and also even China is applying for joining the CPTPP. It is one of the great achievements for Japan's FOIP vision. But we are facing some very serious challenges, like the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the Chinese behavior in the South China Sea, East China Sea, and other maritime domains for changing the status quo by force or coercion. So still, we have to make efforts to promote our vision of FOIP to maintain the stability and also to promote the economic prosperity in this region by using the FOIP. Thank you so much.
Thank you. He talked about your new plan for FOIP and talked about the opportunities and the challenges. I thought that the most of achievement has been done in the economic field, while not many achievement has been made in security fields. Let's talk about it later. Next, I will pass my turn to the ambassador, Catherine Raper.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cho, and thank you also to KIDA President Kim for the opportunity to speak with everyone today. It's great to be back here at the forum again this year, and I'd really like to thank the organisers for offering a platform such as this to explore such an important set of issues. I have to remind myself that my remarks at the forum last year were delivered on the 12th of December. That's less than 12 months ago. And in reflecting on that, it occurred to me that a lot has transpired in that period. Indeed, last year's KIDA event came just a few weeks before ROK Foreign Minister Park Jin unveiled the ROK's Indo-Pacific strategy, as we've been hearing about, which he called a watermark in Korean foreign policy, and indeed we couldn't agree more. And since that time, we have seen the Korean government embark on a more active regional agenda, seeking opportunities to coordinate and cooperate with Indo-Pacific partners to enhance the stability and prosperity of the region. We've also seen the release of the new Korean National Security Strategy, which reinforced the key principles of Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy, as well as President Yoon's desire for the ROK to be a global pivotal state. As Australia's ambassador to the Republic of Korea, I was not just impressed by the ambition and scope of the Korean government's agenda, I was also struck by the prominence of Australia in these strategies. And indeed, on a closer read, it's clear to see why Australia has been identified by Korea as a key partner. That's because there is a remarkable alignment in our interests and outlooks. For example, we are both trading nations that have prospered through open markets based on rules-based trade and relative stability in the decades following World War II. And we are both countries in which the ability to make our own sovereign choices is very much woven into our social fabric. So the right to choose is part of our national identities. So recognising this, both Australian and ROK governments have assessed that we can't be idle in protecting and promoting the systems that grant us the ability to make decisions in our interests. So we must be active, and we must actively contribute to shaping the region that we inhabit. Now, this is especially important in the current regional environment. As we know, and as we've heard from other speakers today, there are powerful drivers of change converging to reshape the international order and challenge us. And these dynamics and the risks they present are only likely to intensify and put more pressure on small and middle powers. Adding to the complexity of these challenges is that they are no longer confined to any single domain. For example, coercive trade measures, unsustainable lending, political interference, disinformation, and efforts to reshape international rules, standards and norms that have benefited all countries, all of these things encroach upon the ability of countries to exercise their agency and decide their own destinies. So this means that our response to these challenges for our economic, diplomatic, strategic and military capacities needs to be equally coordinated, interconnected and interwoven. And I think this is one area where the ROK's government strategies are very strong. They recognise that taking a whole-of-government approach is the only way to address such pressures and challenges. Like the ROK, Australia needs to harness all the elements of our national powers to advance our interests when the implications of unchecked power in our region are so grave. So we must continue to deploy our own statecraft towards shaping a region that is open, stable and prosperous. And that's the type of region that's in the interest of like-minded partners like Australia and Korea. So for us, that's a region that is predictable and operating by agreed rules, standards and laws, where no country dominates and no country is dominated, a region where sovereignty is respected and all countries benefit from a strategic equilibrium. Importantly, we understand that contributing more to the Indo-Pacific requires Australia to have confidence in the resilience of our own systems. That's why Canberra's focus is both international and domestic. We seek to build Australia's internal domestic resilience and reduce our vulnerability to external threats. This means strengthening our institutions at home, promoting robust foreign investment regulations, having a transparent education sector, tightening our coordination on cyber issues, and having a clear understanding of our supply chains. It also means investing in regional architecture and the international systems that provide us with platforms to speak up and work with partners. Such regional architecture includes the ASEAN-led architecture and the Pacific Islands Forum, as well as multilateral trade bodies and the United Nations institutions. It also means that we need to find creative avenues to work with clusters of like-minded partners pursuing specific goals, as Australia does with trilateral mechanisms and the Quad. We must continue to look to provide our regional partners with choice too, for example, in quality infrastructure and investment that meets genuine need, as well as ways to maintain and build on our strong trading relations and accelerate climate action. And this is particularly important for our friends in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, who also support avenues for disputes that are guided by international law, not by power and size. For Australia, building capacity and agency in the region goes hand in hand with ensuring that we invest in appropriate means of deterrence. Central to this is building a more capable, agile and potent Australian Defence Force. As per our recent Defence Strategic Review, Australia is investing in the necessary defence capability, posture and preparedness to meet security challenges over the next decade and beyond. This includes acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines through AUKUS and developing the Australian Defence Force's ability to precisely strike targets at longer range and to manufacture munitions in Australia. Like Korea, though, Australia cannot do all of this on our own, which is why we're continuing to invest in meaningful security partnerships. This, of course, includes the US alliance and also increasingly other partners like Japan and, of course, Korea. To this end, we are expanding our defence cooperation with Korea. As announced by defence ministers in late May, we are developing an enhanced defence bilateral framework. This updated framework will facilitate both governments' ambitions to strengthen the defence partnership between us to better respond to the security challenges in the region and maintain peace, security and prosperity. The bilateral defence relationship is already growing under the 2021 Australia-Republic of Korea Comprehensive Strategic Partnership, including across defence industry, joint military exercises, training, science and technology. Enhancing the bilateral framework would enable deeper cooperation, including towards improved interoperability between our defence forces. Of course, these ideas are just the beginning, and that's why events such as the Hongneung Defense Forum are so timely. We really value opportunities such as today to outline Australia's vision, our regional policies and priorities, and to highlight where our two countries' interests converge. Thank you very much. Kamsahamnida.
Thank you, Ambassador. Next presenter is Ambassador Susan Chinoy.
Thank you very much, President Kim, for this kind invitation. It's my second time around to be here, and it's always a pleasure to see you. I also want to thank the moderator, Mr. Cho. Now, let me come straight to the point. The global situation, in fact, has further deteriorated, as we all know, since we last met here in Seoul. And I can see that the UN and its affiliate organs are even more dysfunctional. They haven't quite been able to deliver in regard to the larger issues of peace and security. And it's also leading to a much greater reliance on bilateralism, minilateralism, plurilateralism, and regionalism. So in that context, I'm not surprised that various geographies, whether in terms of the Euro-Atlantic Partnership or the Indo-Pacific, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, we are seeing a convergence between like-minded partners and not really the kind of usual reliance on multilateral structures like the UN. The problem in the Indo-Pacific is firstly the conceptual part. For me personally, I believe that the Indo-Pacific is not a very recent concept. In the age of exploration, during the age of colonization, the age of seafaring exploration, we saw the great powers, in fact, the great naval powers, colonize in the Indo-Pacific, both the oceans, by using an Indo-Pacific strategy. And so that was par for the course, whether it was the Portuguese, whether it was the Dutch, the British, or the French. But one can say that in more recent times, it's a fact that the Asia-Pacific became the standard bearer for peace and progress in the region. But I would say very quickly to that it is also a concept of the past. The Asia-Pacific truly belongs to the second half of the 20th century. When first the rise of Japan, then the Asian tigers that included the Republic of Korea, and eventually the People's Republic of China, they grew because of a direct connect between their hubs of manufacturing with the world's greatest market across the Pacific, that's in the United States of America. But that has changed in this century. For growth and prosperity are no longer limited to, no longer are the monopoly of a certain geography in Asia, of a certain part of Asia known as East Asia. In fact, that growth and prosperity is spreading now. It has spread to Southeast Asia, to South Asia, to India in particular, the fifth largest economy in the world, soon going to be the third largest in the next 5 years, or before that, all the way to Africa. So if we look at it now, I would say the 21st century, the fit-to-purpose concept is the Indo-Pacific, for it's far more democratic, inclusive, more in tune with the growing aspirations of a much greater number of people across a much greater geography. It's more democratic, so it's a no-brainer for me. Now, the global situation, I think, has seen the three C's, actually. That's COVID, we have seen conflict, particularly in Ukraine, and the great challenge of climate finance and climate change. And so weakened multilateralism doesn't help. But that doesn't mean that we throw the baby out with the bathwater. The focus, as we have seen in the G20 declaration in Delhi, is on improving multilateralism, not on dispensing with it totally. But the big challenge today in the Indo-Pacific is that China regards the traditional stakeholders to be extra-regional powers. So we need to address this issue. For example, the United States, France, Germany, Netherlands, the Europeans are all seen by a very large country, a very big stakeholder in this part of the world, that is China, as extra-regional. Now, are they really extra-regional? Because they've been around for 70 years or more. They have huge investments. They are part of the economic growth and prosperity. They have, territories. They have men in uniform, women in uniform. And so I think this fundamental quandary needs to be addressed by everyone. The other part of the enigma here is that, we cannot keep speaking of Asia-Pacific and India. The world's fifth largest economy and the world's most populous country, 1.4 billion people, is actually not part of the Asia-Pacific. It's not even part of the APEC process. And we know the reasons why that expansion didn't take place. So I think we need to address that part. We see a much greater connect between the economic and security processes at the two bookends that seamlessly connect the Indian Ocean with the Pacific today like never before. One more problem that we need to look at is, and of course this was brought out very articulately by Mr. Tawei, is the tendency that China has to equate the Indo-Pacific with the Quad. Now, for that matter, even the Quad does not say that it is a military alliance. But China, of course, views it in a certain manner of speaking as a military alliance. But to equate that with the more fundamental process of the Indo-Pacific is like really, sort of putting a kind of negative spotlight on the Indo-Pacific, misunderstanding it. And I think we need to look at that. Another issue for me is the fact that it's only recently that the United States has begun to look at the Indo-Pacific with an economic lens. For far too long, the US strayed away from the economic side, the investment side, or the connectivity side, and viewed the whole region only through a securitized lens. And that has proved to be grossly inadequate. I think a very positive change is taking place now, which is very good. One or two last points. Whether the European theater or the Indo-Pacific theater, we are witnessing tensions along 7 Ts. These 7 Ts that I have coined are common to both geographies, or to any other geography. Tensions over trade, technology, territory, tenets, as in narratives, as to whose systems are better, and then you have the T of transparency, and also trust. Did I get 7 there? Trade, technology, territory, tenets, transparency, trust. I'm missing one, terrorism. Now that's a total of 7. The issue here is that trade is fungible, more difficult to control. That's why we are seeing spikes despite deteriorating ties. Trade is growing, generally speaking, including with China. Technology is a more contained space, and we see that playing out in semiconductors, AI, etc. But for me, the disappointing part is that on issues like terrorism, where the global community, including in the Indo-Pacific, should be able to work together, it's unable to work together because of differences related to major power contestation, listing, for instance, of global terrorists under the Al-Qaeda and Sanctions Committee, the 1267 Committee at the UN. We see differences between major powers resulting in so-called technical holds. It's a no-brainer. If there are international terrorists, they must be so listed. So I think the ability to use multilateral space to give a healing touch, to work on larger issues such as terrorism is reducing. Will that affect the ability to work together on other larger challenges like climate change, climate finance? Is a kind of issue that we must keep in mind. The Delhi Declaration for me is a great example of how the world can actually come together in a dream team. The G20 is a dream team. At a time when the UN is dysfunctional, when people are not seeing eye to eye, look at it as the best team possible, very inclusive, even more inclusive now with the coming on of the African Union. But it has the BRICS in it, it has the members of the IDSA in it, it has the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue members, it has the G7 in it. And it's been able to come up with a consensus document. So I think there is hope still of how we can make this work, kind of cooperation in the regional order in the era of the Indo-Pacific. But it's not going to be easy, because Asia has done very well with regard to economic development, but it's not been able to generate an organically developed security architecture, and that remains a challenge today. And it's not helping that we have these 70s, including territorial differences, surfacing. But I do wish that, we can also reach some conclusion with regard to rules-based international order. I see a great gulf there between China and the rest, because China, while riding, the existing global order to its advantage, has also questioned the rules-based international order as being an order created by someone else. And so, if that is the fundamental existential question with regard to a rules-based international order, then there has to be much greater dialogue between all the participants, and I think we are in the right place here for such an endeavor. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think his the point is a little bit different from the others, because he more concentrated on the economic aspects, or the climate change, environment conservation, something like that one. So he talked about there some alienate, sort of alienate countries, which is the called Global South or something like that one. So we have to think about the points that the ambassador has raised. Okay, last one is Dr. Louis Simon from Europe.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cho, and thanks to KIDA and President Kim for the invite. So following up on the ambassador's very eloquent presentation, I just wanted to bring a European perspective into the conversation on the so-called two-front predicament or two-front challenge, namely the need to uphold deterrence in the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific regions simultaneously, or should deterrence fail, fight two wars on concurrent or roughly concurrent timelines. So as all of you in this room certainly know, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has triggered a very intense debate in the United States, and Phil was alluding to that in a way, about how to reconcile the immediate need to help Ukraine defend itself with the need to focus on the China challenge in the Indo-Pacific. For some people, the Biden administration's strong support of a war in Europe strains U.S. diplomatic, military, and industrial resources and stands on the way of a much-needed prioritization of the China challenge in the Indo-Pacific. But other people have instead been arguing that the war in Ukraine can actually help revive U.S. and allied defense industrial capacity, generate important operational lessons, and even help revitalize the U.S.-led alliance infrastructure, transatlantic, trans-Pacific, but also cross-regional. Some people in Europe, I think, may think that this whole two-front puzzle, this two-front frame, is a U.S. problem, and that Europeans should look at the world through their own lens and not just adopt U.S. frames and concepts. But I would personally argue that dealing with strategic competitions in two fronts is not a U.S. problem. It's a problem actually for all those countries whose security is structured around U.S. military power. And ever since World War II, Europe's security and geopolitical architecture has been and remains by and large structured around U.S. military power. And I think the Ukraine war sort of underscores that geopolitical and military strategic reality. And my sense is that today, and sort of thinking about this from a European perspective, today the main sort of challenge to U.S. command of the commons, if you will, and global military power more broadly, comes from the Indo-Pacific, not Europe. And if the United States sort of fails to meet that Indo-Pacific challenge, then the entire global architecture structured around U.S. military power would suffer. That means that America's prioritization of the Indo-Pacific is actually in the European interest. And this is why I believe the question of how Europe can contribute to a more efficient management of the two-front predicament will actually be central to transatlantic relations in the coming years, I think. So sort of taking these debates as a point of departure, I guess a key question would be how can Europeans contribute to a more efficient management of this so-called two-front predicament? I would unpack that into two sub-questions, if you will. The first one is how can Europeans help free up U.S. strategic bandwidth in Europe so as to enable a proper U.S. prioritization of the Indo-Pacific without weakening Europe's deterrence architecture? That's question number one. And question number two would be, in what ways, if at all, can Europeans contribute to U.S. and Indo-Pacific allied efforts to uphold deterrence here in this part of the world? So just a couple of preliminary thoughts before wrapping up. So I would personally expect, and there's a lot of discussion about the future of U.S. force posture and defense strategy in Europe, I would personally expect the United States to continue to play an important role, leading role even, in the provision of strategic enablers and enhancement of deterrence in Europe for at least two reasons. The first one, I think, relates to the enormous gap that exists between U.S. and European capabilities in key areas like nuclear, command and control, ISR, missile defense, or electronic warfare. And the fact that developing state-of-the-art capabilities in many of these areas requires multi-decade investments. And the second and related reason is because European states lack the financial depth individually, and in order to develop equivalent capabilities to the United States in these critical areas, Europeans would need to move towards military integration, and there are a number of obstacles in that regard. Now, when it comes to actually providing a direct contribution to conventional deterrence and defense in Europe, in the front line, which is in the eastern flank, as you know, there I see the potential for a much more radical rebalancing in terms of burden sharing and for Europeans to actually take the lead. However, I would still argue that it's important for the U.S., from a European perspective, to maintain some sort of conventional military role and presence in Europe, not just for assurance purposes, which is a particular need for Eastern Europeans, but also to manage escalation dynamics and avoid entanglement risks. My sense is that a European led effort in conventional deterrence would actually need to revolve around a much stronger cooperation between Germany and Poland in the conventional domain, particularly in the land and air domains, and perhaps also revolve around three other critical nodes in the eastern flank: Sweden and Finland in the north, the Baltic states in the east, and Romania in the south, with Ukraine ideally acting as a sort of geopolitical shield. But just a couple of final thoughts on Europe's potential contribution to the Indo-Pacific before wrapping up. So the general sense, it seems to me, is that Europe's contribution to Indo-Pacific security is limited to the economic and diplomatic aspects, and that there's no point talking about a European military role, particularly in wartime, right? What we hear often in the United States, in Europe, and also here, is that Europe should just focus on holding the line in Eastern Europe, free up US military bandwidth, and leave the Indo-Pacific to the US and its regional allies, who can bring much more power to bear. But my question would be, is that the right analysis? Of course, we all know that in an Indo-Pacific contingency, the US would be the critical player, that goes without saying. But my sense is that in any Indo-Pacific contingency, the underwater, the undersea domain would be particularly critical, not least in light of the presence of significant A2AD capabilities. And I think offensive submarine-based land attack capabilities would be particularly critical. Developing those capabilities takes decades. It's not just about having the boats. You need the enablers, the operational experience, the interoperability with the United States. And today, and probably for the next 10 years at least, it seems to me that British and French in particular, nuclear-powered attack submarines, conventional submarines, will remain quite formidable even by Indo-Pacific standards. And beyond the undersea domain, I'd highlight other areas, such as in particular Europe's potential contribution to secure the sea lanes of communication in the Indian Ocean, which would be quite important in Indo-Pacific contingency, but also in other areas like space, where European capabilities can actually provide substitution services in case of a major attack on a US infrastructure, but also allow for a much greater transatlantic space tracking and monitoring capacities, but also ammunition by investing in a common pool of inter-theater capabilities that are useful and for both theaters. I think I'll leave it at that and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Now we heard the presentation from 7 speakers, and I'm going to move to the second round. I think Hamne is a little bit behind the schedule, but I'm not frustrated because I'm ready to sacrifice on lunchtime. So not much time. So I'm going to ask some specific some question to each participants. If I ask then individually, then ask what I asked. First, the Professor John. Actually, he teaches the international politics in Seoul National University. The international politics professor interested in the entrapment and abandonment. Because we issued our own Indo-Pacific strategy. Maybe I might guess the possibility that we will be involved in some contingencies occurred in any place in the Pacific will increase. So is there I guess is there any chance that the kinds of our policy increase the possibility of a military is a great involvement in the contingencies? If it is the case, what measures should be required to properly restrict ROC's involvement in the contingencies?
Thank you very much. That's a tough question. First, I think Indo-Pacific strategy, South Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy is closely linked with our alliance policy, but not a part of the alliance policy. So even though we pursue Indo-Pacific strategy, the idea that we might be entrapped by U.S. possibly assertive strategy toward Taiwan, that is not the necessarily a problem for South Korea, because we try to consolidate liberal international order by having the Pacific strategy rather than exclude China or antagonize China. So it's at the level of the planning between Indo-Pacific and alliance strategy a little bit different. The idea of integrated deterrence, I think it's a very ambitious and crucial, by having integrated part. When we do deterrence, we can combine multi-domain, and we can build some kind of multi-layered alliance structure. We are transferring from hub and spoke structure to more complex and multi-layered alliance structure in Indo-Pacific. Also, we can combine military and non-military measures to complete our deterrence, and also adopt a fourth industrial revolution type of new technology. So those are all good things, and having integrated deterrence by integrating ROK and US military posture, I think we can have a better deterrence. It can apply to Taiwan, but my basic idea is that both China and United States want status quo rather than radically change the status quo. China has proposed the idea that as far as Taiwan sticks to the idea that without independence declaration, China will pursue gradual and peaceful unification, and U.S. is still supporting one China policy. This kind of security dilemma, because after the Ukraine war, the risk of unprovoked aggression might be applied to the Taiwan Strait. So we'll see. But Taiwan Strait, cross-strait stability is directly linked to South Korea's interests, the sea lane of communications, all those, freedom of navigation. So if something happens, so before that happens, I think we can have a collective deterrence posture with the United States, so that we can have some room for solving the disputes through peaceful means, even though there is a changes in military balance power between Taiwan and China. Maybe China might be emboldened to have some changes in the status quo if China predominates militarily over alliance military power in Indo-Pacific. But by having more solid posture, then we might have a better deterrence posture.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Because we don't have time, I'm going to comment on that one. But I will ask to Philip that under the Indo-Pacific strategy, U.S. has deepened cooperation and enhanced interoperability with its allies and partners. Various the cooperation framework has been used, like the bilateral, minilateral, multilateral, or regional cooperations like AUKUS and the trilateral and the Quad or something like that one. But I think the collective cooperation, the framework, like the NATO type one, has never been tried in this area. So my question is, in the future, do you think there is a chance that the kinds of the framework can be tried in this region?
Sure. The short answer is no. But let me elaborate on that. First, because I think countries are not prepared to make reciprocal security commitments to each other, which is the foundation of the NATO alliance under Article 5, nor are they prepared to delegate their military forces to command by a multilateral alliance. So that's one reason. Second is that even though countries share some common concerns about China and are willing to cooperate to try to shape Chinese behavior, I don't think they're willing to join an organization like a Asian NATO that is specifically aimed against China. That's a bridge too far. Now that said, I think there's two things that are possible. We did some work at the Council on Foreign Relations on virtual alliances in the mid-90s, That's an interesting way to think about this, where you have looser forms of security cooperation that can ratchet up in the face of higher perceived threats. And indeed, that's one way of interpreting the Quad, the extent to which it has become more willing to do things in the face of perceived Chinese pressure. So I think that's one area that's worth thinking about. And the second is to think about the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe as a potential model for ideas in terms of preventive diplomacy or crisis management that might be applied in Asia, either within the context of the ASEAN Regional Forum, adapting to take on some of those roles, or perhaps a new, more inclusive security organization in Asia that was focused on that kind of a security agenda. But it wouldn't be a traditional multilateral alliance. Thank you.
Philip, okay, from the that way, you mentioned that you don't agree with the Indo-Pacific strategy. Even you don't use that terminologies. So my question is, what is the desired international order you think in the Indo-Pacific region? What kinds of actions should be made by the countries in the region, including China, to advance toward the desirable status?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this question. Actually, I have no. I think China is willing to use any term so long as it's open. In 1980, early 1980, when China was invited to join APEC, at the beginning China was also hesitant, but now China is a big advocate for Asia-Pacific cooperation. So the problem is, does China geographically, China's part of the Indo-Pacific, but is China part of Indo-Pacific strategy? This is the question I think every country need to answer. If everybody see you are only a background, you are only a challenge, you are only a target, why should China join that Indo-Pacific strategy? So this is a question. So no matter what, how do we call this region or how do we call this strategy, I think what China wants is there is only one region and one system, no matter how you call it, from the US to India, we are the whole region, we are one system. We don't want to see two blocks like Soviet Union and the US in the Cold War. We don't want to see two ideological groups, democracy versus autocracy, likely mandate country versus others, and we don't want to see split or divided supply chain. I think these are what we want. If we are in the one system, if we are in the same region, we may have a lot of conflicts, we may have different interests, but we can try to solve or mitigate those differences and disputes in this system. I don't want to be too long, but I really don't think China, for instance, China opposes rule-based order. China is the beneficiary from rule-based order. And we don't oppose free and open Indo-Pacific. Why? Why should we? We are the largest trading country in the world. Why? How can we welcome a closed Indo-Pacific? So China wants one region, one system. This is a regional system, I mean. This is my short answer to your question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think it's a little bit ironic because the Indo-Pacific strategy talks about the inclusiveness, diversity, and that way talks about that too. Also, China also wants to have the rule-based order like United States. So we definitely can recognize two different perspectives of both countries. I think we have to discuss these kinds of topics in the future. Okay, Japan. I think from your presentation, economic framework in Indo-Pacific is a little bit complicated. CPTPP, initiated by Japan, RCEP, initiated by Chinese, provide a different framework. On the other hand, the US, which joined the NIDS, is trying to initiate a new framework, IPEF, Also, the supply chain issues based on the security concerns for the economic issues in this region. My question is, in the future, how do you expect the security and economic issues to interact in the region?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Cho, for your questions. Yeah, I think that the security and the economy will very closely intertwine to make the in order to make the Indo-Pacific free and open. Yeah, I think that from the Japanese point of view, as I said in my presentation, promoting the economic development is one of the important measures for Japan's FOIP vision or FOIP policies. And I think that this, based on this basic foundation, Japan is promoting the RCEP to include the China, and also the Japan is promoting the other multilateral economic cooperations like the CPTPP, and also the Japan is open to welcome the China to the CPTPP as long as the China shares the basic rules by the CPTPP. Anyway, what I'd like to emphasize here is that the contenting with China is not the Japanese purpose of our FOIP vision, but the maintaining the peace, stability, and also the economic development are the very important national interest for Japan. So now the establishing the stable and the constructive relation with China is very important national interest of Japan. So to pursue this purpose or our strategic goal, we are pursuing both the economic relations, economic cooperations for extending our common ground, including China, and also to promote the security cooperation to deter any attempts to change the status quo by force or coercion. That's my answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question is to the Australian ambassador. First, I am very appreciated the compliments that you made during your presentation. I think the South Korea and Australia is almost similar role in the world, like the seeking a role as a global pivotal actors. So, and we have very close relationship, but we have some difference, like the threat perception. South Korea is more concentrated on the North Korea, against North Korea than the other potential adversary or some competing countries, while the Australians doesn't have great interest in the North Korea. So, I mean, there is differences. But because we try to seek the very common the policies. I guess through there some kinds of cooperation, we can advance our relations and we can contribute to the Indo-Pacific strategy. So how do you think about this?
Well, thank you very much for your question. I guess at the outset, I'd actually take issue with the premise of your question. Australia does indeed care a great deal about North Korea and the threat that their provocations and illegal actions create in the Indo-Pacific region. We see that through Australia's enforcement of both United Nations and unilateral sanctions and the role we play in monitoring sanctions compliance in the region. And what I think is that both Australia and the Republic of Korea under the Yoon administration are seeing that North Korea threat in an Indo-Pacific context. So it's not possible to approach or have any sort of resolution of the Korea threat without looking at the wider Indo-Pacific region. And you need to make sure that you are working to preserve a region based on international law and rules and institutions, and working with like-minded partners to enhance security through cooperation in the region in order to provide the best framework for countering threats such as North Korea. So indeed, your question asked whether the alignment of Indo-Pacific strategies between Australia and Korea offers potential to do that, and I think my answer is very much yes. I mentioned in my remarks that Australia and Korea have a comprehensive strategic partnership. One of the pillars of that is on security and strategic issues, and there's a number of initiatives that fall underneath that that are enabling us to cooperate both bilaterally and regionally. I also mentioned that we are working on an enhanced defence bilateral framework, which will again add more substance to that. But just some examples. In the Indo-Pacific, we see that Korea has recently adopted its KASI, its Korea-ASEAN Solidarity Initiative, which seeks to enhance Korea's engagement from a strategic as well as an economic perspective in the region. We're seeing great opportunities for Australia and Korea to work together there, and one recent example is that Korean had representatives to Australia's Indo-Pacific Endeavour mission in Manila who helped us work together on teaching maritime law. Another example is in the Pacific, where we saw President Yoon host a very successful Pacific Islands Forum summit back in late May. And again, there's initiatives under that where Australia and Korea are working together. For example, in Nauru, on an operation to remove unexploded ordnances called Operation Render Safe. These are just two examples, but they are showing that by having very closely aligned perspectives on the security challenges that we are facing in the region and aligned policies and strategies for how to address that, that is opening up more opportunities to work together, both bilaterally and in the region, which is helping to make us all safer. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Next one, the Ambassador from India. I guess the Global South is interested in the economic growth. However, harmonization of economic growth and the environmental conservation would be difficult. As a country that seeks to be the voice of a Global South, what is your strategy for promoting both issues without conflict? Do you think a system like Quad will help to solve both issues? In addition, do you think the cooperation in the field will help to increase cooperation in the security field?
Thank you for that question. Let me say that it's not a contradiction to speak of economic growth and environmental conservation, though it appears so, that any kind of conservation that we seek will be at the cost of global economic growth. But that's not true. The fact of the matter is that today all new global growth is coming out of developing countries, out of the emerging markets and developing countries, much more than in the past. So we have to keep in mind that the global engines of growth have shifted to a different geography, but even more importantly, new global growth is coming out of different geographies, not the traditional ones. And so if that is the premise, then we have to keep in mind that economic growth in the developing countries, the large and emerging markets and developing countries, including, and that is India, will have to spend much more on nationally determined commitments as far as the climate goals and objectives are concerned, and that much more will have to be spent on climate adaptation and technologies in that field. And so this is where I think we need to focus on the kind of money that's required for this transition. The Delhi Declaration speaks of $5.8 trillion required by developing countries simply to make, fulfill their nationally determined commitments. And then separately, about $4 trillion annually is required to enable them to undertake the necessary adaptations. Now, this is a no-brainer, therefore, that unless the North and the South kind of cooperate, nobody is going to get to their net zero targets, not just net zero 2050, but even individual targets. Having said that, let me say that in the Quad, which is also looking at 4 pillars, one very important pillar is clean economy. And clean economy also means that new technologies will be used. So I think the Quad will play a role, quite apart from the fact that it is heavily involved in resilient supply chains, especially cooperative structures that have been created between India, Japan, and Australia. The Prime Minister of India has proposed what is called Lifestyles for Sustainable Development, or LIFE. It started out as Lifestyle for Environment. And the whole concept is very simple, that at this challenging moment, can we get all the nearly to be 8 billion people on Earth to become pro-planet people? That at our individual levels, no matter whether we belong to the developed world or the developing countries, we exhibit behavior that's more responsible, which is aimed at what you call sustainable production and sustainable consumption in our own little ways to ensure that we look after the Earth's resources in a more responsible manner. So I don't think there is a contradiction here, but it requires greater understanding and greater cooperation. A very big thing that's come out of the Delhi Declaration, the G20 Declaration, is this initiative that proposed by India, but also supported by the United States, Brazil, Argentina, Italy, called the Global Biofuels Initiative. But the short message here is that all kinds of forms of energy will have to coexist for a while. But we should also focus much more on renewables, clean energy, biofuels at that, and see how to go forward. Can I just chip in very quickly on the geostrategic part? You see, the only country in the world that talks of an Indo-Pacific strategy is actually a country that has not subscribed to the Indo-Pacific vision, that is China. In fact, no other country speaks of an Indo-Pacific strategy. Everybody is speaking of a vision for the Indo-Pacific. The only country that spoke in the past of Indo-Pacific strategy happened to be Japan in 2016, but within a year, by 2017, when Japan passed new legislation permitting its private sector companies to collaborate with Chinese entities in the context of Belt and Road initiatives in Southeast Asia, the word strategy was dropped and it became vision. So it is vision, it's not strategy. And I would suggest that motives not be attributed to the vision of the Indo-Pacific, which is for the global good. I think that's the way to look at it. One good thing is that I've noticed that scholars, even in China, do not disregard the Indo-Pacific. They use the term Indo-Pacific. The government does not use it, but scholars do use it. And I think Mr. Tawe may correct me if I'm wrong, but the Chinese government has also stopped talking about the Indo-Pacific being ocean foam that will soon dissipate and disappear and all that, because it's hardly likely to disappear. It's here to stay. And so I think there is some evolving outlook there as well. And last point is that, we keep talking about the Quad. The Quad is not a military alliance or a naval alliance, but it can flip over in the future. We have seen during the two world wars that the coalitions didn't form at the time of the outbreak of the wars. Different countries came on as their interests were affected. The United States fought the First World War only after 1917, not in 1914 like the British and the Japanese and others did. Same thing we saw in the Second World War. So the Quad has the capacity to flip over. Whether it flips over into something else will actually depend on, in many ways, the attitude of people towards what is otherwise an anodyne pro bono concept called the Indo-Pacific. Thank you.
Okay, last question to Louis Simon. You said that Europe is not likely to make any contribution other than sending a nuclear preparedness submarine if real contingencies occurred in the Pacific areas. But this is it's a contingency time. But I think Europe and the Indo-Pacific countries has a lot of chance to cooperate during a peacetime. So what kinds of cooperation can make? Not just in the Pacific countries, but the South Korea with South Korea. What kinds of the measures or actions can be made between those countries?
Thank you. That's an important question. Just to clarify, I was alluding to nuclear-powered submarines. But yeah, I think in terms of peacetime, I would say that European peacetime deployments in terms of European vessels to the Indo-Pacific, whether that is Taiwan Strait, South China Sea, that does have a signaling value, I think, and could conceivably affect, in this case, China's cost-benefit calculation. Now, in terms of practical cooperation, and I realize there's more and more discussion here in Korea, but also in Japan or Australia about NATO and NATO AP4, and a lot of focus is on issues like countering disinformation, cybersecurity cooperation, both in a NATO context but also in an EU context. The NATO Secretary General has also alluded repeatedly to the need to monitor China's presence and military activities in the Euro-Atlantic area of responsibility by way of exercises and so on. And all of that is important, but in my view, and sort of following up on what I was saying earlier, the key issue for Europeans is to figure out how US commitments in the Indo-Pacific, whether in peacetime or wartime, affect the US role in Europe and US planning resources and military resources for Europe. And my sense is that the same sort of applies to AP4 countries, but the other way around, right? Not least in light of the Ukraine war. So that means that I don't think we should be talking about a permanent NATO presence in the Indo-Pacific by way of capabilities or headquarters, but rather I think that Europeans, and that includes NATO because of its role in the European security architecture, should improve their situational awareness about Indo-Pacific dynamics, should have eyes and ears in the Indo-Pacific, and that requires much stronger links, I think, to relevant regional commands, in particular for Europeans, Indo-PACOM, but also Japan, Australia, and ROK military commands, and also stronger links, in particular, I would say, between the North Atlantic Council and AP4 countries, but also by bringing in, even if in an observer capacity, AP4 countries into the NATO defense planning process, so that we can both have better situational awareness in terms of what's going on in each other's region and how that might affect the U.S. force posture and global strategy, because I think that is the key factor bringing the two regions together. The fact that the deterrence architecture of both regions revolves around the same factor, which is ultimately U.S. military power.
Thank you. We actually hear all the presenters' speech. And I'm sorry we don't have enough time and to open this session to a floor. But for the just one desperate person, if you'd like to ask just one question. So anybody? Okay.
I just want to ask the representative coming from China with regard to your comments on China regional strategy, especially regarding the common share community as the big vision of China for regional corporations versus the regional corporations and also the Indo-Pacific strategies issued by countries in the region. What is your comparisons and what the common points you can draw upon things that can create the corporations for countries in the region? Thank you. I'm coming from IDIA, Vietnam. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. This is really my great honor, the only question directing to me. I think what China has advocated by our government is rather, I will say it's a vision. It's a long-term vision and full of idealist vision, I will say. I'm not an idealist. I'm an IR scholar, professor. I think I'm a realist. So I think that's a good vision, but to be honest, I lack the accurate understanding of how to achieve that, how to implement that, particularly, as you said, facing this very complicated geopolitical situation in this Indo-Pacific region. So I think for this shared, this community of shared future, at least I think one thing is important, as I said in my presentation. I think we think this is a community, right? No matter China, Vietnam, or Korea, Japan, the U.S., we are in the same community. So we can, China want to, as I said, one region, one community. This is what we want. We don't want it to be split into two or several. I think this is currently, in the short run, I think this is our focus. But in the long run, how can we achieve that idealist vision? I don't know. Maybe we need to. I think China need to work out more specific, opinions or and advocate for that later further. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. I think it's time to finish my session. That I think the presentation was great, and this topic should be discussed much more in the future. Because of my incapability, I cannot control the time schedule, but just ask more questions to the presenters while we are eating their lunch. Thank you for everybody.